For a transcript of this episode, training plans, and more, visit marathonsfortherestofus.com. Hey, I'm Coach Carl. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my tips on how to successfully negative split a marathon. Last week in the video we talked about why a negative split makes sense both from a physiological and a psychological perspective. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that video yet, go back and watch it and then come back here and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how you can set yourself up for a great negative split in your next race. So before we start, just a quick note, negative splits for the marathon are the best and most efficient way to run a marathon, but you can still run a great time, you can still PR, you can still hit your goals by running even pace or even a very slight positive split in the marathon as well. And this is particularly true if your current PR comes with a really big positive split. Even just by making progress towards a negative split, you can see some really good improvement. So don't feel like it's negative split or bust. And for most people who maybe haven't had an opportunity yet to really develop their endurance a lot, the negative split is going to be much less common than an even split or a slight positive split. So these tips and suggestions I'm going to give you are really about putting yourself in the best position to achieve a negative split, your best position to utilize the endurance that you do have, whether that ends up being a negative split, an even split, or a slight positive split. So with that in mind, the first tip is to start slow. And this may sound kind of silly, it may sound kind of obvious that if you want to negative split a marathon, you should start slow. But really that first mile is super important because it sets the tone for the rest of the race. It sets the tone and the rhythm that your body's going to be running with. And running too fast in that first mile can do a whole lot more damage to the rest of your race than running too fast once you're warmed up in, say, mile 8 or 10 or 12 or something like that. Your body's not going to be in the same position to absorb that faster mile in the first mile. So the first mile, running slow, running nice and easy and relaxed is really important. Now, running that first mile easy can be difficult, especially if it's a smaller marathon, because you've got the race day adrenaline, you're rested, you feel good, you're super excited for the race. But if it's a bigger race, you've got crowds that are probably going to hold you back anyway. That's great. Use those to your advantage. Use those as an opportunity to hold back early in the race and save some of that energy for later. So I think it's really important that first mile not to fight the crowds, to be aware of the pace that you're running and make any adjustments that you need to as early as you can so that you don't dig yourself in a hole early on. Tip number 2 is to have a plan for the pace, have a plan for the race, and stick to it. And this is especially important in the first half of the race, much like what we talked about with the first mile of the race. But know where you want to be time-wise at, say, mile 4, mile 8, mile 12, something like that. Various points along the course in the first half of the race. So that way, if you get to those points and you're ahead of pace, you can slow down. Now, it will be difficult to slow down because you'll be excited because you're feeling good and, hey, I got there ahead of pace. This is fantastic. Well, I would hope that you feel really good during the first half of your marathon. If you don't, you're probably in for a really painful slog in the second half. So if you feel really good at mile 8 and you're ahead of the pace that you want to be at, don't take that as a sign that, hey, this is my day, I'm going to crush it today. Take that as a sign as, you know what, I'm going to slow everything down, I'm going to get back to the pace that I want to be running, and if I'm still feeling great later in the race, we can deal with that when it happens. Tip number 3 is to use the first half of the race to set yourself up for success. And this is not just from a pacing standpoint, although obviously that is important as well, but this is as much from a fueling and a hydration standpoint. You know, much like with the pace, you're going to be feeling good during the first part of the race, so it can be easy to skip hydration stops or to fall off of your fueling plan. But if you fall off early, it's much harder to get back on it later in the race. So by sticking with your fueling and hydration plan during the first half of that race, you can really set yourself up for success in the second half of the race. Even if your stomach starts to turn on you a little bit or something like that, you've got more fuel in your body already, and that's going to allow you to push hard when the time comes when you're trying to negative split. Tip number 4, when you get to the second half of the race, don't go crazy. Don't say, great, here's the halfway point, now I'm really gonna crank down the pace. If we're talking about a realistic negative split, we're probably talking about something in the neighborhood of about 1%, which for a 4-hour marathoner is about 2.5 minutes. So this is not something where you all of a sudden need to really make a big shift in how hard you're pushing or, the pace that you're running. This is more about a gradual pickup over the course of the second half of the race rather than a sudden shift right at the halfway point. And for most people, I'm going to recommend that you really try to hold the pace steady till at least mile 18 or mile 20. There's the old joke that the first half of the marathon is the first 20 miles and the second half is the last 6.2. I think there's a lot of truth to that when you're trying to run a negative split. I think by mile 18 or mile 20, you have a realistic idea of how you're going to feel that day and how much energy you have left that you can push hard and push towards the end of this race with. And I think if you try to make that determination at mile 13 or 14 or even mile 16, I think there's a much greater chance of having, a so-called false positive where you feel like this is really your day, you pick it up and then you crash and burn before the end. Wait until that 18 or 20 mile mark, and I think you're gonna have a much more realistic gauge of what you have left to give. Tip number 5 is to use the pace groups, but to be careful when using the pace groups. Pace groups can be an awesome tool, particularly in the early stages of the race, because they allow you to just sort of zone out and save any mental energy that you need for later in the race. However, pace groups may be great at finishing at the time they're supposed to, but they're not always great at running the pace that they should be throughout the entire race. So although I'd like you to zone out a little bit and save that mental energy, don't check out completely, because you need to be aware of your pace. You need to be aware if the pace group is running too fast too early in the race. They're going to be fine to slow things down and hit their target time at the end, but you may be in a situation where you're digging yourself in too deep by running too fast early, and you may not be able to recover the way that they are. So use the pace groups as a tool, but definitely keep your wits about you and stay alert and aware of what's happening with your pace throughout the race. Either way, I think the approach that you want to take is, if you're, say, running 3:30 for the marathon, I think you either want to start with, say, a 3:35 group if they have one, and then you can gradually work your way up to the 3:30 group. Or if the pace groups are more spread out than that, then I think that you want to try to get up to the 3:30 pace group around mile 4 to 6, somewhere in there. That'll give them an opportunity to settle into the pace, get used to what they're doing, and really get into a good rhythm, and it'll make sure that you don't start out too fast if they start out too fast. Tip number 6, and this may be the biggest tip, is to practice, 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 practice. Our body likes routine. Our body likes to do things that it's used to doing. And so the more frequently during your training that you can start slow and finish your runs faster, and it doesn't need to be fast. You certainly don't need to be running all out, but faster than you started is a good way to build that habit and get your body and get your brain used to running faster and pushing harder later in the run when you're tired. I think this is particularly effective in long runs, but really it's something that you can practice during speed workouts, easy runs, all those sorts of things. And really, I think the more the better, as long as you're not trying to really crush that last mile. That's not probably what's going to happen in the marathon. And really, we need to have a good idea of how we can incrementally increase the pace rather than how we can just shift from running easy to sprinting all out. That may reach the letter of the goal in terms of running your fastest mile as your last mile, but probably doesn't hit the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish with a negative split. So those are my tips and suggestions for how to set yourself up for your best chance to run a successful negative split in the marathon. I hope you found the information useful, and if you have topics and suggestions for future videos, definitely let me know. You can leave them in the comment section below, or you can email me at carl@runningcoachcarl.com. Thank you so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.